The city of Chicago came alive at dusk, its streets shimmering with neon lights and the persistent hum of life. The Loop District buzzed with the clinking of glasses, the blaring of car horns, and the chatter of a million conversations, all merging into a single chaotic symphony. Down a quieter alley, just off West Madison Street, however, the world was painted in softer hues. Flickering streetlights that cast long, shifting shadows, and a faint, lingering mist from a recent rain. It was in this dimly lit world that 17-year-old Cassie Marlow found herself crouching behind a dumpster, her breaths coming quick and shallow. The distant wail of a police siren reminded her how close she'd come to being caught. Clutched tightly in her hands was an old cassette tape, its plastic casing scratched and worn, but still intact. Cassie was tall for her age, with sharp features softened by freckles across her nose. Her tangled dark hair peeked out from under the hood of her sweatshirt, which was 2 sizes too big. Her knuckles were scraped, and her Converse shoes, once white, were now stained with a mix of dirt and oil from the alley. She could still hear the words of the man she had escaped from moments earlier. "Who sent you?" he had barked, his voice booming through the otherwise empty warehouse. "Do you even know what's on that tape?" Cassie didn't know. Not yet. But she had a feeling it was important. Important enough to make someone chase her into the night, like she was some kind of fugitive. A life in the shadows. Cassie wasn't a thief. Not really. She preferred to call herself a finder. In her world, she didn't steal for profit or pleasure. She found things that were lost or overlooked, picking through abandoned buildings and trash heaps for discarded treasures. Sometimes it was jewelry left behind in pawn shops, or a diary with stories still waiting to be told. But today her find had turned into something much bigger than she bargained for. The cassette tape had been hidden inside an old boom box in a storage unit she'd snuck in earlier that day. It had seemed innocuous at first, just a dusty relic from a bygone era. But then she'd noticed the label on the tape, worn and faded but still readable. Project Whisper, classified. Something about those words sent a chill down her spine. By the time Cassie realized the significance of her find, she was no longer alone in the warehouse. The man who'd shouted at her was tall and broad, wearing a tailored suit that looked out of place in the grimy storage unit. His sunglasses reflected the dim light, even though it was already well into the evening. And he had backup, a wiry, twitchy guy with a handgun holstered under his jacket. Cassie had barely escaped. She didn't even remember the sprint to the alley. All she knew was that she now held something people were willing to fight for. And if they wanted it that badly, there was no way she was letting it go. The promise of answers. "Cassie!" The voice startled her. She whirled around, her back pressed to the cold brick wall, clutching the tape to her chest. Standing at the mouth of the alley was Toby, her 19-year-old neighbor, and more importantly, her only real friend. Toby was the kind of person you couldn't ignore in a crowd. Not because he was loud or flashy, but because of the quiet intensity in his eyes. He was lanky, with a mop of blonde curls and a perpetual smudge of grease on his hands from working at his uncle's auto shop. "What are you doing here?" Toby asked, his brow furrowing as he stepped closer. "Nothing," Cassie lied instinctively, shoving the tape into the pocket of her hoodie. Toby raised an eyebrow. "You've got that I just escaped from a murder scene look again." Cassie shot him a glare. "I didn't escape from a murder scene." She paused. This time, Toby folded his arms, clearly waiting for more of an explanation. Cassie sighed and pulled the tape out of her pocket, holding it up for him to see. "I found this in a storage unit. I think it's important, Toby. Like, secret government important." Toby's expression shifted from skeptical to intrigued. "What's on it?" "I don't know," Cassie admitted. "I don't even have a tape player to check. But someone definitely didn't want me to have it." Toby rubbed the back of his neck. "All right," he said slowly. "Let's go back to my place. My uncle has this old cassette player in the garage. If anyone asks, we'll say we're looking for classic rock." A voice from the past. Toby's uncle's garage smelled like motor oil and stale coffee. Tools hung on every wall, and a rusted Mustang sat half-finished in the corner. The old cassette player was on a shelf, covered in a fine layer of dust. Cassie wiped it clean with her sleeve and slid the tape inside. The click of the play button was loud in the quiet room. For a moment, There was nothing but static. Then, a voice crackled to life. A man's voice, deep and urgent. "This is Dr. Alan Crane," the recording began. "If you're hearing this, it means they've found me, or worse. What I'm about to say will put my life, and possibly yours, in danger. But the truth must be known. Project Whisper was never about defense. It was about control." Cassie and Toby exchanged a glance, their faces pale. The recording continued, each word pulling them deeper into a story they didn't fully understand. Dr. Crane spoke of experiments, dangerous, unethical experiments, conducted on unwilling participants. He mentioned names of powerful corporations and shadowy government agencies. Whisper, Crane explained, isn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It's a method of silencing opposition, permanently. Entire communities wiped out, voices erased, and they want to scale it globally. The tape cut off abruptly, leaving only static in its wake. For a long moment, neither Cassie nor Toby spoke. "What the hell is this?" Toby finally asked, his voice shaking. Cassie didn't answer. She couldn't. All she knew was that her life had just gotten a lot more complicated. A new target. The garage door creaked open, and Cassie and Toby both jumped. Standing in the doorway was a man in a leather jacket with a cigarette dangling from his lips. His face was lined with scars, and his eyes gleamed with something that could only be described as trouble. "Cute little operation you've got here," the man said, stepping inside. "But I'm going to need that tape." Cassie's heart raced. She recognized him from the warehouse, the twitchy guy with the gun. Toby instinctively stepped in front of her. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. The man smirked. "Someone who doesn't ask questions he doesn't want answers to." He pulled out his handgun, leveling it at them. "Now, hand it over." Cassie's mind raced. She glanced at the tape player, then at Toby, then at the door leading to the street. She had one chance. Before she could overthink it, she grabbed the tape from the player and bolted toward the door. "Cassie!" Toby shouted, but she didn't stop. The man cursed and gave chase, his footsteps echoing behind her. Cassie didn't know where she was running. She just knew one thing. The secret on that tape was bigger than her, and she wasn't going to let it die in a dark alley. Cassie's feet pounded against the pavement, the weight of the cassette tape in her pocket pulling at her like an anchor. Behind her, the sharp, rapid footsteps of the man in the leather jacket, Twitch, as she'd come to think of him, echoed through the quiet Chicago streets. The cold air bit at her face as she ran, her breath fogging in front of her. The alleys of the industrial neighborhood were a labyrinth of rusted fences, abandoned loading docks, and graffiti-covered walls. It wasn't the kind of place Cassie had planned to spend her Friday night. "Stop running, kid," Twitch's voice bellowed from behind her. "You're only making it worse for yourself." Cassie didn't answer. Her mind was in overdrive, calculating escape routes and searching for any kind of advantage. She darted through a narrow gap between two dumpsters, hoping to put some distance between them. Her lungs burned, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the tape in her pocket could mean the difference between truth and silence. A sudden ally. She burst out of the alley and onto a wider street. Her sneakers skidded on the slick pavement as she glanced around, desperately searching for somewhere to hide. Just ahead, a group of teenagers loitered near a beat-up station wagon, laughing and passing around a bag of chips. "Hey!" Cassie yelled, sprinting toward them. "Help me!" The group turned to look at her, their smiles fading as they noticed the panic in her voice. "Whoa, what's going on?" asked a girl with bright pink hair and a leather jacket. She stepped forward, holding her hands up. Cassie barely had time to explain before Twitch emerged from the alley, his leather jacket flapping as he jogged after her. His handgun wasn't drawn anymore. Too public, but his glare was enough to freeze the group in place. "Hand over the tape, and this ends now," Twitch growled, ignoring the bystanders entirely. Cassie stepped back, putting the teenagers between her and Twitch. "He's trying to kill me," she said quickly, her voice trembling but determined. The group hesitated, exchanging glances. Pink hair frowned, clearly torn between wanting to help and avoiding trouble. "Look, kid," Twitch snapped, taking another step forward. "You don't understand what you're messing with. Just give me the tape, and we'll forget this ever happened." Cassie clenched her fists. She didn't know why. but she could feel in her gut that surrendering wasn't an option. Whatever was on that tape mattered. Before Twitch could get closer, the guy leaning against the station wagon, a tall, lanky teen with a skateboard tucked under his arm, took a step forward. "Back off, man," skateboard guy said, his voice steady. "You're scaring her." Twitch let out a low, humorless laugh. "This doesn't concern you, kid." "It does now," Pink Hair added, crossing her arms. She looked at Cassie and jerked her head toward the station wagon. "Get in." Cassie didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled into the back seat as the group quickly piled into the car. Skateboard guy jumped into the driver's seat, throwing his board into the passenger side, and turned the ignition. Twitch lunged toward the car, but the engine roared to life, and the station wagon peeled out, leaving him shouting curses in their wake. New faces, new questions. Cassie slumped against the seat, her chest heaving. The interior of the station wagon smelled faintly of fast food and motor oil. The group stared at her, waiting for an explanation. "So," Pink Hair said, turning in her seat to face Cassie. "Mind telling us what the hell that was all about?" Cassie hesitated. Could she trust them? They had helped her escape, but she didn't know anything about them. "Look," Cassie started, choosing her words carefully. "I found something. Something people don't want me to have." Skateboard guy glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "What kind of something?" Cassie reached into her pocket and pulled out the cassette tape. She held it up for them to see. "This. It's called Project Whisper. And if what I've heard is true, it's a really big deal." The car fell silent. Pink Hair leaned forward, inspecting the tape like it might reveal its secrets if she stared hard enough. "A cassette tape?" she said finally. "What? Is it a mixtape so bad they're willing to kill over it?" "It's not music," Cassie said, her voice sharp. I don't know what it is exactly, but there's a recording on here. A scientist talking about experiments, about wiping people out, silencing them." "Silencing them how?" asked the guy in the passenger seat, who was busy chewing on a toothpick. "I don't know all the details," Cassie admitted, "but it's bad. Real bad." Skateboard guy let out a low whistle. "So, what's the plan? You gonna take it to the cops?" Cassie laughed bitterly. "And tell them what? That I stole it from some creepy guy in a warehouse? No way. I need to figure out what's really on here first." Pink Hair smirked. "You're either really brave or really stupid, kid." "Both," Cassie said without hesitation. Danger in the rear view. The station wagon sped through the streets of Chicago, heading toward Toby's uncle's garage. Cassie had insisted on going back for Toby, her only real ally in this mess. But the sense of relief from escaping Twitch was short-lived. In the rearview mirror, Cassie spotted headlights, two sharp, piercing beams that seemed far too close. She craned her neck to get a better look. It was a black SUV. "He's following us," Cassie said, her voice tight. Skateboard guy frowned. "Seriously? How'd he find us so fast?" "Maybe he didn't lose us," Cassie muttered, sinking lower in her seat. Pink Hair glanced over her shoulder, her expression darkening. "All right, genius. Got any bright ideas?" Cassie swallowed hard. "Lose him. Please." Skateboard guy didn't need to be told twice. He yanked the wheel hard, swerving onto a side street and sending everyone lurching in their seats. The SUV followed, a narrow escape. The next few minutes were a blur of sharp turns, screeching tires, and near misses. The station wagon sped through narrow streets and alleys, dodging pedestrians and weaving between cars. Cassie clung to the door handle, her heart pounding in her chest. The SUV was relentless, sticking to them like glue. Skateboard guy gritted his teeth. This thing wasn't built for car chases. "Just keep going," Pink Hair shouted. Finally, they approached an underpass where construction barriers lined the road. Without warning, Skateboard guy jerked the wheel, steering the car down a narrow path between the barriers. The SUV hesitated for a split second, just long enough to lose momentum. Skateboard guy floored the gas pedal, and the station wagon shot out the other side. When Cassie looked back, the SUV was gone, blocked by the maze of barriers. The group let out a collective sigh of relief. "Nice driving," Cassie said, her voice shaky. Skateboard guy smirked. "Yeah, well, don't get used to it. You owe me gas money." Pink Hair shot him a glare. "Not the time, dude. Cassie leaned her head back against the seat, clutching the tape tightly in her hand. She didn't know who Twitch and his people were, but one thing was clear. They weren't going to give up. And the secrets on this tape? They were only the beginning. The station wagon came to a screeching halt outside a dimly lit garage on the south side of Chicago. A flickering neon sign overhead read, Martin's Auto Repair, though it looked like it hadn't been repaired itself in decades. Cassie climbed out of the car, her legs still trembling from the high-speed chase. The weight of the cassette tape in her pocket felt heavier than ever, like a ticking time bomb counting down. "Your friend lives here?" Pink Hair asked skeptically, leaning against the car door. "It's his uncle's garage," Cassie explained. "Toby hangs out here after work. It's the safest place I can think of." Skateboard guy glanced around the empty street. "Safe? You sure about that? Feels like the kind of place where horror movies start." Cassie ignored him and jogged toward the side entrance. The others followed, their shoes crunching on the gravel. Cassie knocked 3 times on the metal door and waited. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and Toby's familiar face appeared. His wide-set eyes immediately filled with relief when he saw Cassie. "Cassie, where the hell have you been?" he asked, pulling her inside. "You said you'd meet me hours ago, and then He stopped mid-sentence, noticing the group of teenagers behind her. "Who are they?" "They helped me," Cassie said quickly. "I'll explain everything, but we don't have much time." Toby opened the door wider, letting the others step inside. The garage was cluttered with old car parts, toolboxes, and a half-dismantled motorcycle. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dull, yellow light over the room. "You're bringing strangers here now?" Toby asked, crossing his arms. "They're not strangers," Cassie replied. "They saved my life." Pink Hair smirked. "Technically, you saved yourself by running to us. We just happened to have a getaway car." "Semantics," Cassie muttered. "A plan begins to form." Once everyone was inside, Cassie sank into a worn-out chair near the workbench, her head spinning. The adrenaline from the chase was wearing off, leaving behind a heavy exhaustion. Toby crouched in front of her, his tones softening. "Cassie, what's going on? You look like you've been through hell." She pulled the cassette tape from her pocket and set it on the workbench. "This," she said. "It's called Project Whisper." Toby frowned. "What's on it?" Cassie hesitated. A voice. A scientist talking about experiments. About silencing people. "I don't know everything yet, but it's bad, Toby. Really bad." Toby stared at the tape, his expression darkening. "And the guys who are after you? They want it back," Cassie said simply. "They were willing to kill her for it," Pink Hair added, leaning against the workbench. Toby ran a hand through his hair, muttering a curse under his breath. "You don't even know what's on it, but they're already chasing you? That's why I need to listen to it," Cassie said, sitting up straighter. "I need to know what's so important. But I don't have a cassette player." Toby scratched the back of his neck. "We've got an old tape deck in the office. Uncle Martin uses it to play his golden oldies while he works. Should still be functional." Cassie nodded. "Good. Let's listen to it now." The Whisper secrets. Toby led them to a cramped office tucked into the back corner of the garage. The walls were lined with faded posters of muscle cars and pin-up models from the 80s. A dusty cassette player sat on the desk, surrounded by a tangle of wires and a stack of old tapes. Cassie took a deep breath and slid the tape into the player. She hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the play button. "Are you sure about this?" Toby asked, his voice low. Cassie nodded. "We have to know." She pressed play. The tape crackled to life, filling the room with a low hum of static. Then a voice emerged, calm, clinical, and unsettlingly detached. "Project Whisper, Subject 32. Recorded April 3rd, 1996. Test results indicate successful suppression of vocal frequencies at a range of 10 to 12 decibels. Further experimentation is required to determine long-term effects of neural interference." Cassie exchanged a nervous glance with Toby. "What does that even mean?" The voice continued. Subjects displayed varying degrees of compliance post-suppression. High-frequency waves effectively disrupted speech patterns, rendering verbal communication impossible in over 80% of cases. Physical side effects include disorientation, memory loss, and the tape abruptly cut to static, then resumed. Directive from upper management. Proceed with deployment. Targeted areas include key descent zones. The static returned, this time louder, drowning out the voice entirely. Cassie hit stop, her heart racing. Key descent zones? Pink hair repeated, her brows furrowed. What, like protests? They're using sound waves to shut people up, Toby said, his voice filled with disbelief. Literally, they're silencing them. But why? Skateboard guy asked. What's the point? Cassie stared at the cassette player, her mind racing. It's control, she said quietly. If people can't speak out, they can't fight back. The cost of the truth. The group sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Cassie could feel the room growing colder, as if the air itself had absorbed the tape's chilling implications. We need to get this to someone who can stop them, Toby said finally. Like who? Pink hair asked. The cops? The government? You think they're not already involved in this? Toby frowned, but didn't argue. We could leak it, skateboard guy suggested. Post it online, let it go viral. Cassie shook her head. The people chasing me aren't just going to let that happen. They'll shut it down, maybe even take down anyone who shares it. So, what do we do? Pink hair pressed. Cassie thought for a moment, her mind racing through the possibilities. She couldn't take this to the authorities, not when she didn't know how far the conspiracy went. And releasing it online felt like a death sentence. Then it hit her. The radio station, she said. Everyone turned to look at her. There's a pirate radio station downtown, Cassie explained. They don't follow FCC rules. They'll broadcast anything. You think they'll help? Toby asked. They have to, Cassie said. If we can get the tape on air, we can expose this before they have time to stop us. The shadows close in. As the group debated their next move, the sound of tires screeching outside the garage cut through the air. Cassie froze, her blood running cold. Toby peeked through the blinds, his face going pale. It's them, he whispered. Cassie's heart pounded. How did they find us? They must have tracked the car, skateboard guy muttered. Great, pink hair snapped. Next time, let's steal a bike instead. Toby locked the door and turned to the group. We can't stay here. They'll tear this place apart. Cassie's mind raced. She grabbed the cassette tape and stuffed it back in her pocket. We need to go. Now. There's a back exit, Toby said. It leads to an alley. Good, Cassie said. Let's move. The group scrambled toward the back door as heavy footsteps and angry voices filled the garage. Cassie's pulse pounded in her ears as she followed Toby through the narrow alleyway, the tape clutched tightly in her hand. The shadows of their pursuers loomed larger, their voices echoing through the night. We can't let them catch us, Cassie whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Because if they did, the truth would be lost forever. The alley was narrow, the cold air biting against Cassie's skin as she and the others sprinted through the darkness. The faint shouts of their pursuers echoed behind them, each sound driving her adrenaline higher. She clutched the cassette taped tightly in her pocket, its hard edges digging into her palm, a sharp reminder of what was at stake. Toby led the way, his familiarity with the area their only lifeline. The faint light from a street lamp ahead guided them toward what Cassie hoped was safety. Are they gaining on us? Pink hair hissed, glancing over her shoulder. Cassie didn't dare look back. Just keep running. Toby darted around a corner, his hand brushing against the peeling brick wall for balance. This way, he called. The group followed, their footsteps pounding against the cracked pavement. The sound of tires screeching from the street sent a jolt of fear through Cassie's chest. They're splitting up, skateboard guy shouted, his voice tinged with panic. Cassie glanced at him sharply. How do you know? He pointed to the faint shadow of a car rounding the opposite corner. Because they're trying to cut us off. Perfect, Pink hair muttered sarcastically. Nothing like a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek to end the night. A dangerous gamble. Toby led them to the edge of the alley, where a chain-link fence loomed in their path. He grabbed the metal links and began to climb, his movements quick and practiced. Cassie hesitated for only a moment before following him, her fingers slipping against the cold metal. Pink hair climbed beside her, grumbling under her breath. "Are you sure this is the best idea?" Pink hair asked. "Do you have a better one?" Cassie shot back. I could have stayed home, Pink Hair muttered, hoisting herself over the top of the fence. By the time Cassie reached the other side, her arms were trembling, and her breath came in short, ragged gasps. She dropped onto the cracked pavement, glancing around to make sure everyone had made it over. Toby motioned for them to keep moving. There's a safe house about 4 blocks from here, he said. What kind of safe house? Pink Hair asked suspiciously. It's an old diner, Toby replied. Nobody uses it anymore, but it has a basement. We can lay low there until we figure out our next move. Cassie nodded. Let's go. They made their way through the maze of back streets, the distant shouts and engine roars fading into the background. Cassie's heart still pounded, the weight of their predicament pressing heavily on her chest. The tape in her pocket felt like a curse, a dangerous secret that had already cost too much. But the thought of giving it up, of letting the truth stay buried, was even worse. The diner's shadows. The old diner looked like something out of a forgotten postcard. Its once bright neon sign was cracked and dark, and the windows were coated with grime. The group slipped inside, their footsteps echoing against the dusty tiled floor. Toby led them to a door in the back, pushing it open to reveal a narrow staircase. The basement, he said. It's not much, but it'll keep us hidden. Cassie followed him down, her nerves on edge. The basement smelled of mildew and rust, but it was dry and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. As soon as they were settled, Skateboard Guy plopped down on an overturned crate, running a hand through his hair. Okay, someone explain to me why we're risking our necks for a stupid tape. It's not just a tape, Cassie said, her voice firm. It's proof. Proof that they're silencing people, that they're controlling them. Yeah, I get that, Skateboard Guy replied. But why does it have to be us? Shouldn't this be like a journalist problem or something? Pink Hair leaned against the wall, her arms crossed. Because no one else knows about it. It's not like we can just drop this in a mailbox and call it a day. Exactly, Cassie said. If we don't get this out, no one will. Toby, who had been pacing near the stairs, spoke up. We need to figure out how they found us at the garage. If they tracked us once, they can do it again. Cassie frowned, her mind racing. It has to be the car. We must have picked up a tracker during the chase. Or, Pink Hair added darkly, they've been watching you for longer than you think. The thought sent a chill down Cassie's spine. A tense divide. The group fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of their situation settling over them like a heavy blanket. Cassie could feel the tension in the air, Skateboard Guy's reluctance, Pink Hair's frustration, Toby's quiet worry. This isn't going to work if we don't trust each other, Cassie said finally, her voice cutting through the quiet. Trust? Skateboard Guy laughed bitterly. I barely know any of you. I'm only here because he pointed at Pink Hair, dragged me into this. Pink Hair rolled her eyes. Oh, please. You're here because you love a good adrenaline rush. Don't act like you didn't enjoy that car chase. Enough, Cassie snapped. None of us asked for this, okay? But we're in it now, and we don't have time to argue. Skateboard Guy shrugged, leaning back on the crate. Fine, but if I get shot, I'm blaming you. Duly noted, Cassie muttered. The enemy closes in. The uneasy truce didn't last long. As the group debated their next move, the sound of distant footsteps reached Cassie's ears. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Do you hear that? She whispered. Toby nodded, his expression tense. They're here. How? Pink Hair hissed. We left the car behind. They must have had someone following us, Toby said, his voice low. Cassie's mind raced. We need to get out of here. There's no other exit, Toby replied. The stairs are the only way out. Great, Pink Hair muttered. Trapped like rats. Just what I always wanted. Cassie scanned the basement, her eyes landing on an old vent cover near the ceiling. What about that? Toby followed her gaze. It leads to the alley, but it's small. We'll have to crawl. Better than nothing, Cassie said. The great escape. With Toby's help, Cassie pried the vent cover loose. The metal groaned in protest, but it finally gave way, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel. Ladies first, Skateboard Guy joked, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. Cassie shot him a glare before climbing into the vent. The metal was cold and sharp against her palms, but she pushed forward, her determination outweighing her fear. The others followed, their movements slow and cautious. The tunnel was tight, and every sound seemed amplified, the shuffle of shoes, the clang of metal. As they neared the end, the distant sound of voices grew louder. "They're inside the diner," Toby whispered from behind her. Cassie's pulse quickened. "We need to move faster." Finally, they reached the end of the tunnel. Cassie kicked open the vent cover and dropped into the alley below, her legs buckling slightly upon landing. The others followed one by one. "Where to now?" Pink Hair asked, brushing dirt off her jacket. Cassie glanced down the alley, her mind racing. "The radio station," she said. "It's now or never." The alley stretched ahead of them like a lifeline, but the tension in the air felt suffocating. Cassie's pulse thudded in her ears as she led the group away from the diner, their footsteps muffled against the cracked pavement. The distant hum of cars and the occasional shout from a far-off street served as reminders that the enemy wasn't far behind. The weight of the cassette tape in her jacket pocket had grown heavier with every step. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was a beacon drawing danger closer. And yet, it was also their only hope. "The radio station's on 14th and Pierce, right?" Cassie asked, her voice low but urgent. "Yeah," Toby replied, his eyes scanning the darkened streets. "It's about a mile from here. If we stick to the back alleys, we might avoid being spotted." "Might isn't super reassuring," Skateboard Guy muttered, though he kept pace. "Would you rather head back to the diner?" Pink Hair shot back, her tone sharp. "Let's just focus," Cassie cut in. "The tape needs to get out. That's all that matters." Her words silenced the group, but the tension between them lingered. A brief respite. They found an empty laundromat on the way, its fluorescent lights flickering faintly through a grimy window. Toby peered inside, then motioned for them to follow. "We'll rest here for a few minutes," he said. "But not too long. They'll be combing the area soon." The laundromat was eerily quiet, the smell of detergent and mildew hanging in the air. Rows of washing machines stood like sentinels, their chipped enamel reflecting the dim light. Cassie sank onto a plastic chair, her legs trembling from exhaustion. Pink Hair leaned against a nearby dryer, her face pale but composed. Skateboard Guy paced near the entrance, peeking through the window every few seconds. Toby sat beside Cassie, his gaze distant. "Do you think they know about the radio station?" Cassie shook her head. "If they did, they'd already have people waiting for us there. Unless they're just letting us lead them there," Pink Hair said darkly. "Not helping," Cassie snapped. Pink Hair raised her hands defensively. "Just saying, we can't underestimate these guys." "She's right," Toby admitted, though the admission seemed to weigh on him. "We have to assume they're always one step ahead." Cassie nodded, though her stomach churned at the thought. "Then we keep moving. The longer we sit here, the more we're risking." The radio station's history. As they made their way through the streets, Cassie couldn't help but reflect on the radio station. WCRV 92.7 FM wasn't exactly a household name. The building had seen better days, its once bright facade now faded and peeling. But it held a special place in the community, a station that aired local news, independent music, and, most importantly, unfiltered truths. Cassie had grown up listening to its broadcasts. Late-night talk shows that tackled issues no one else wanted to touch. DJs who played underground tracks that spoke to the soul. It had always felt like a small beacon of hope in a city overshadowed by corruption. Now, it was their best chance to expose the truth, the shadow of doubt. As they neared the station, the streets grew quieter, the city's usual hum replaced by an uneasy stillness. It was almost too quiet, and a sense of foreboding settled heavily on Cassie's chest. "We're close," Toby whispered, pointing to a weathered building up ahead. The station's call letters, WCRV, were barely visible on a rusted sign near the roof. Cassie quickened her pace, her breath fogging in the cool night air. But as they approached the entrance, a figure stepped out of the shadows. "Going somewhere?" The voice was calm, almost mocking, and Cassie's blood ran cold as she recognized it. Crane. He stood in the alley like he owned it, his suit immaculate even in the dim light. Behind him, two other men loomed, their broad frames casting long shadows against the brick walls. Toby froze, his eyes darting to Cassie. Pink hair and skateboard guy exchanged worried glances, their earlier bravado now replaced with unease. "You've been busy," Crane said, his gaze fixed on Cassie, "leading us on quite the chase. I'll admit, it's been entertaining." Cassie stepped forward, her heart hammering. "We're not giving you the tape." Crane smirked. "You think I care about the tape? That's just the bait." "Bait?" Toby echoed, confusion etched on his face. Crane's smirk widened. "This isn't about the tape. It's about control. About reminding people like you that stepping out of line has consequences." Cassie's fists clenched. "You're scared," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Scared that people will hear the truth." Crane's expression darkened, the playful edge in his tone vanishing. "You think you're the first idealist to try and expose the truth? You're just kids. Kids playing a game you don't understand." Cassie met his gaze, unflinching. "Maybe, but even kids can make a difference." For a moment, Crane said nothing, his cold eyes assessing her. Then he turned to his men and nodded. "Get the tape." A fight for survival. The alley erupted into chaos. One of Crane's men lunged toward Cassie, but Toby intercepted him, shoving him back with all his strength. Pink hair swung her backpack at the other, the impact knocking him off balance. "Run!" Cassie shouted, clutching the tape as she bolted toward the station's entrance. Skateboard guy hesitated for only a moment before following, his sneakers skidding against the pavement. Toby and Pink hair stayed behind, their shouts and grunts filling the air as they tried to hold off the attackers. Cassie's breath burned in her lungs as she reached the door, fumbling with the handle. It was locked. Come on," she muttered, her fingers trembling. "Step aside," skateboard guy said, slamming his skateboard against the glass. The window shattered, the sound echoing through the alley. Cassie climbed through the jagged opening, careful not to cut herself. Once inside, she reached back to help skateboard guy through. The station was dark and eerily quiet, the faint hum of electrical equipment the only sound. "This way," Cassie said, leading him toward the recording studio. The broadcast. The studio was small but functional, its walls lined with soundproofing foam. A microphone stood at the center, flanked by a mixing board and an old computer. Cassie wasted no time. She inserted the tape into the deck and hit play. The tape whirred to life, its contents spilling out into the empty room. Voices filled the air, muffled at first, then clearer. It was the meeting from the warehouse, Crane's threats, and the incriminating discussion between the shadowy figures. Cassie leaned into the microphone, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. "To anyone listening, this is Cassie Taylor. This tape contains evidence of corruption and manipulation. They've been silencing people, controlling them, but we can't let them win. Please share this. Spread the word. The truth matters." She hit the button to broadcast the recording, the sound waves carrying their fight to anyone tuned in. The price of truth. Skateboard guy peered out the window, his face pale. We've got company." Cassie turned to see Crane and his men outside, their shadows stretching against the station's walls. "They're going to break in," he said. Cassie's mind raced. The recording was broadcasting, but they wouldn't have much time. "We just need to hold them off until it finishes," she said. "How?" Cassie grabbed a heavy chair and wedged it against the door. "Like this." As the sounds of pounding fists and shouts grew louder, Cassie braced herself. The truth was out, but the cost of sharing it had just begun. The door shuddered violently under the weight of Crane's men, the muffled sounds of their grunts and pounding fists growing louder with each hit. Inside the studio, Cassie and skateboard guy braced the heavy chair against the door, their hands trembling with the effort. The recording played on, spilling out over the airwaves, each second ticking closer to the truth being fully unleashed. "We can't hold this much longer," skateboard guy hissed, his voice strained. His back pressed hard against the door as another thud rattled its frame. Cassie's mind raced. They'd made it this far. They couldn't let it end here. "We just need a little more time," she said, more to herself than to him. Outside the studio, Pink hair and Toby's shouts could still be heard. The two had stayed behind to delay Crane's men, but judging by the sounds of heavy footsteps nearing the station, it wasn't enough. "Cassie," skateboard guy said, his voice urgent. "We're outnumbered. What's the plan?" Cassie glanced at the old computer humming beside the soundboard. A faint, desperate idea began to form in her mind. "The broadcast is already running," she said, grabbing the nearest keyboard. "If I can set it to loop, the tape will keep playing even if we're not here." Skateboard guy's eyes widened. "You mean run?" "No," Cassie snapped, though the thought gnawed at her too. "I mean, we need to make sure this message gets out no matter what. If they destroy the tape, we're done." She began typing furiously, her fingers flying across the keys. The computer was ancient, its interface clunky and slow, but she refused to let that stop her. Sweat dripped down her temple as she navigated through the broadcasting software. Holding the line. Outside the studio, Pink Hair and Toby fought with everything they had. One of Crane's men, a burly figure with a shaved head, lunged at Toby, who barely managed to duck in time. Using the momentum, Toby swung his leg out and tripped the man, sending him sprawling to the ground. "Nice!" Pink Hair shouted, jabbing her elbow into the ribs of another attacker. But for every hit they landed, another man appeared, their sheer numbers overwhelming. Pink Hair glanced toward the station's shattered window and saw Crane standing in the shadows, watching the chaos unfold with unnerving calm. His hands were tucked into his pockets, his expression as detached as if he were observing a chessboard. "Cassie better have something good planned," Pink Hair muttered, wiping blood from the corner of her mouth. Toby looked at her, his chest heaving. "She will. She always does." Desperation in the studio. Back in the studio, Cassie's heart pounded as the program finally loaded. She scanned the interface, her eyes locking onto the option to loop the broadcast. Come on," she muttered, clicking frantically. Skateboard guy let out a yelp as another blow to the door cracked the wooden frame. "Cassie, whatever you're doing, do it faster." "I'm trying," she shouted back. Another crash reverberated through the room, and the door splintered slightly at the edges. Through the cracks, Cassie could see the cold, unflinching gaze of Crane's men. She forced herself to focus, typing a final command into the system. The interface blinked for a moment before confirming the loop. The tape was now set to replay indefinitely. Even if they destroyed the equipment, the signal would continue broadcasting until someone physically shut down the station's transmitter. "It's done," Cassie said, standing abruptly. Skateboard guy turned to her, his face pale. "Great. Now what?" Cassie's eyes darted around the room, searching for options. Her gaze landed on the emergency exit at the back of the studio. "We go out that way," she said, pointing. Skateboard guy hesitated. "You sure it's not locked?" "It's our only chance," Cassie replied. "Let's move." The two of them sprinted toward the exit just as the door to the studio burst open. Crane's men poured inside, their faces twisted with determination. "Get the tape," one of them barked. Cassie shoved the emergency door open, the cool night air hitting her face like a slap. She didn't stop to look back, grabbing Skateboard guy's arm and pulling him along. An unexpected betrayal. Crane stepped into the studio, his polished shoes crunching against the shards of broken wood and glass. His sharp eyes scanned the room, landing on the empty tape deck and the glowing computer screen. "They looped it," one of his men muttered, glaring at the equipment. Crane's jaw tightened, though his expression remained eerily composed. "Smash everything," he ordered. "Rip the wires. Tear down the antennas. I don't care how long it takes. Stop the broadcast." His men immediately got to work, their heavy hands yanking cords and dismantling the equipment. But even as sparks flew and machines shattered, the sound of the tape's broadcast continued to hum faintly through the air. One of the men turned to Crane, his face pale. "The transmitter's external. It'll take time to—" "I don't want excuses," Crane snapped. But even as he barked orders, Crane's calm demeanor wavered. For the first time, Cassie and her friends had managed to hit him where it hurt. And that made them more dangerous than he'd ever anticipated. Into the shadows. Cassie and Skateboard Guy ran down a narrow alley, their breaths ragged and their hearts pounding. Behind them, the faint sound of chaos echoed from the station, but they didn't dare stop. "This way!" Skateboard guy shouted, pointing to an abandoned construction site up ahead. Cassie followed without hesitation, the adrenaline in her veins propelling her forward. They ducked behind a stack of wooden pallets, their bodies pressed low to the ground. For a moment, all was silent except for the sound of their breathing. "Do you think Toby and Pinkhair made it out?" Skateboard guy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Cassie hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted, the weight of uncertainty gnawing at her. "But we can't stay here. We need to regroup." Skateboard guy nodded, though his face was etched with worry. A ray of hope. Back at the station, Toby and Pinkhair had managed to slip away during the chaos. They stumbled into an alley several blocks away, bruised and exhausted but alive. Toby leaned against a wall, clutching his ribs. "We need to find Cassie," he said between labored breaths. Pinkhair glanced around, her eyes sharp despite the blood trickling down her temple. "She'll head for a safe spot, somewhere we can lay low." "Like the park?" Toby suggested. Pinkhair shook her head. "Too obvious. She's smarter than that." Before Toby could respond, a faint sound caught their attention, a police siren in the distance. Pinkhair's face darkened. "If the cops show up, they'll just cover for Crane. We need to stay ahead of them." Toby nodded, pushing himself upright despite the pain. "Then let's move." A new plan. Cassie and Skateboard Guy finally stopped at an old storage unit on the outskirts of the city. It was a place Cassie's mom had once rented during one of their many moves, and the key still hung from her keychain. They slipped inside, locking the door behind them. The air was stale, the faint smell of dust and mildew lingering in the darkness. "What now?" Skateboard Guy asked, sinking onto a crate. Cassie pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed. "We call for help." "Who?" "Maya," Cassie said, her voice firm. "She'll know what to do." As the phone rang, Cassie's mind raced. The broadcast was out, but Crane wouldn't stop until he buried the truth. And if they didn't find a way to fight back, everything they'd sacrifice would be for nothing. The chill of the storage unit crept into Cassie's bones as she sat on an old crate, her phone pressed to her ear. Each ring seemed louder in the silence, echoing in her mind like a countdown. Pick up," she whispered under her breath, glancing nervously at Skateboard Guy. He sat slumped against a pile of dusty boxes, trying to catch his breath after their narrow escape. Finally, the line clicked. "Cassie!" Maya's voice burst through the phone, sharp and urgent. "What's going on? I've been trying to reach you for hours." "We don't have time," Cassie said quickly, pacing the small space. Crane's men stormed the station. "They're trying to shut down the broadcast." Maya sucked in a sharp breath. "Did they stop it?" "No. I looped the broadcast before we escaped, but they're tearing everything apart to stop the signal." Cassie paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Maya, we need a plan. They won't stop until they bury this story, and us along with it." Maya's voice grew steadier, more determined. "Okay, first things first. Where are you?" "We're in an old storage unit on the east side," Cassie replied, giving the address. "But I don't know how long we can stay here. They'll come looking." "Stay put for now," Maya said. "I'll send someone to pick you up. In the meantime, I'll see what I can do to amplify the signal remotely. If we can push the broadcast to more frequencies, it'll be harder for them to kill it completely." Cassie exhaled, a flicker of hope breaking through her fear. "Thank you, Maya. You're the best." "Just hang in there," Maya said, her voice softening slightly. "And Cassie, be careful. Crane's not just some thug. He's a shark, and you're swimming in his waters now." The line went dead, leaving Cassie clutching the phone like a lifeline. A dangerous pursuit. Across town, Crane's men combed the streets with ruthless efficiency. Black SUVs prowled the alleys and back roads, their headlights cutting through the dark like searchlights. Inside one of the vehicles, Crane sat in silence, his sharp eyes scanning the cityscape. His phone buzzed on the console, and he answered without hesitation. "They slipped away," came the voice on the other end, tinged with frustration. Crane's jaw tightened, but his tone remained calm. "Find them. I don't care how long it takes. And if they've contacted anyone, cut off those loose ends too." "Yes, sir." Crane ended the call and leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming against the armrest. This wasn't just about silencing a broadcast anymore. Cassie and her friends had made it personal, challenging his control and exposing his vulnerabilities. And Crane didn't lose. Toby and Pink Hair's next move. Toby and Pink Hair darted through the maze-like streets of the city, their breaths visible in the cold night air. They'd managed to evade the SUVs for now, but they knew it was only a matter of time before Crane's men caught up. "We need to find Cassie," Toby said, his voice hoarse. Pink Hair shook her head. "We don't even know where she is. For all we know, she could be halfway across the city." Toby clenched his fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. "We can't just leave her out there. She wouldn't leave us." Pink Hair stopped abruptly, grabbing Toby by the shoulders. "Look, I get it, but running around aimlessly won't help her. We need to think." Toby hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Okay, so what's the plan?" Pink Hair glanced around, her sharp eyes scanning the area. "We head for the park," she said finally. "It's open, easy to spot trouble before it gets too close. And if Cassie's looking for us, she might head there too." Toby frowned, but followed her lead. Deep down, he hoped she was right. The safe house. The creak of the storage unit door made Cassie's heart leap. She spun around, her fists clenching instinctively. But instead of Crane's men, she saw a figure in a hoodie step inside, their face obscured by the shadows. "It's me," the person said, pulling back their hood to reveal a young woman with dark, curly hair and a piercing gaze. Cassie sagged with relief. "Maya." Maya stepped further inside, glancing around the cramped space. "This place sucks," she said bluntly, "but it'll do for now." Skateboard guy raised an eyebrow. "Nice to meet you too." Maya ignored him, turning her attention back to Cassie. "We need to move you somewhere safer. Crane's men are crawling all over the city." Cassie hesitated. "What about Toby and Pink Hair?" "They stayed behind to hold them off." "We'll find them," Maya promised. "But right now, we need to keep you out of Crane's reach. You're the one he's really after." Cassie swallowed hard, guilt twisting in her gut. She hated the idea of leaving her friends behind, but Maya was right. If Crane got his hands on her, it would all be over. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's go." A close encounter. As the group slipped out of the storage unit and into the shadows, the sound of an approaching engine sent a jolt of fear through Cassie's chest. She froze, her ears straining to catch any hint of who it might be. "Get down," Maya whispered, pulling her into the shadows of a nearby dumpster. Skateboard guy followed, crouching low as the beam of headlights swept across the alley. A black SUV crawled past, its windows tinted and its presence menacing. Cassie held her breath, her heart pounding in her ears. For a moment, it seemed like the vehicle would move on. But then it stopped. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out, his silhouette illuminated by the streetlights. Cassie's stomach churned as she recognized the sharp, deliberate movements. It was Crane. He stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the area. Cassie's body tensed, every instinct screaming at her to run. But then, to her surprise, Crane turned back to the SUV and got inside. The vehicle rolled away, disappearing into the night. Cassie let out a shaky breath, her limbs trembling. "That was too close," Maya muttered, helping her to her feet. Skateboard guy nodded, his face pale. "Let's get out of here before he changes his mind." The park reunion. Meanwhile, Toby and Pink Hair reached the park, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The open space stretched out before them, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the ground. "Do you see anyone?" Toby asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Pink Hair shook her head. "Not yet, but let's keep moving." They weaved through the park, their eyes scanning every corner. Just as Toby began to lose hope, a familiar figure emerged from the darkness. "Cassie!" Toby shouted, his voice cracking with relief. Cassie turned, her face lighting up as she saw him. "Toby!" The two sprinted toward each other, relief washing over them as they reunited. Pink Hair smirked, crossing her arms. "Told you we'd find her." Maya appeared moments later, pulling Cassie into a brief hug. "We're all here," she said. Now, let's figure out how to end this. The plan takes shape. As the group huddled together in the park, Maya laid out her plan. Crane's men are tearing apart the city looking for us. But that gives us an advantage. While they're distracted, we can focus on keeping the broadcast alive. How? Toby asked. Maya's eyes gleamed with determination. I've already patched the broadcast into secondary transmitters across the city. But if we can get to the main tower and boost the signal, we can make sure the story spreads even further. Cassie nodded, her resolve hardening. Then let's do it. But even as they finalized their plan, Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that Crane was one step ahead. The cold wind bit at Cassie's face as the group made their way through the city streets. Every shadow seemed alive, every passing car a potential threat. Though reunited, the tension among them was palpable, the weight of what they had to do pressing down like an invisible hand. Maya led the way, her phone's GPS lighting up the cracked screen. The main broadcast tower isn't far from here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But getting there without being spotted, that's the real challenge. Cassie glanced over her shoulder. Toby was walking beside her, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets, his expression grim. Pink hair and skateboard guy trailed close behind, the latter fiddling nervously with his board. What if Crane's already there? Toby asked. He might be, Maya admitted. But if we wait any longer, we'll lose our window. Right now, they're still scrambling to find us. We need to act before they regroup. Cassie nodded, her jaw tightening. She knew Maya was right, but the thought of walking straight into the lion's den made her stomach churn. The broadcast tower. The tower loomed in the distance, a skeletal structure of steel and blinking lights piercing the night sky. It stood on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. This is it, Maya said, stopping a few blocks away. They crouched behind an old dumpster, surveying the area. The tower itself looked deserted, but a single black SUV was parked near the entrance, its engine still running. Crane, Cassie whispered, her breath fogging in the cold air. Not necessarily, Pink Hair countered. Could just be one of his goons. Either way, we have to assume they're expecting us, Maya said. She glanced at Cassie. You're the only one who knows how to override the tower's manual controls. Can you do it? Cassie hesitated. I think so, but it'll take time. If someone's in there, then we'll handle it, Toby said firmly, stepping forward. Cassie's heart swelled with both pride and worry. Toby, it's too dangerous. Cassie, you're the one who always told me to stand up for what's right, Toby interrupted, his voice steady. I'm not a kid anymore. Let me do this. Cassie stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but stick close to the group. We're stronger together. Breaking in, the group approached the fence cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. Maya produced a pair of bolt cutters from her bag, the blades glinting under the faint glow of the tower's lights. Where do you even get those? Skateboard guy whispered. Don't ask, Maya replied, snapping the lock off with a single motion. The gate creaked open, and they slipped inside, their breaths held as they crossed the open lot toward the base of the tower. The SUV remained parked, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. Cassie felt her pulse quicken with each step. Maya led them to a side door, pressing her ear against it before motioning for them to follow. The door opened with a faint groan, revealing a dimly lit hallway that smelled of oil and mildew. This way, Maya whispered, pulling up a blueprint of the tower on her phone. The control room is at the top. We'll take the stairs. As they crept through the building, every creak of the floorboards and distant hum of machinery set their nerves on edge. The ambush. They were halfway up the stairs when the first sound of footsteps reached them. Someone's coming, Pink Hair hissed, her hand flying to Cassie's arm. The group froze, pressing themselves against the wall as the footsteps grew louder. A flashlight beam swept across the stairwell, its cone of light bouncing off the metal walls. Cassie held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure stepped into view, a burly man in a dark jacket, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. He wasn't Crane, but he was clearly one of his men. Before anyone could react, Toby lunged forward, swinging a rusted pipe he'd picked up earlier. The metal connected with a dull thud, and the man crumpled to the ground. "Toby," Cassie whispered harshly, rushing to his side. "Are you okay?" Toby nodded, his hands shaking. "I had to. He was going to see us." Maya knelt beside the unconscious man, quickly searching his pockets. She pulled out a key card and a walkie-talkie. "This might come in handy," she said, slipping them into her bag. "Let's move," Pink Hair urged. That noise probably alerted someone. The control room. The control room was a small, cluttered space filled with outdated equipment and blinking monitors. Cassie immediately set to work, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she accessed the tower's systems. "What do you see?" Maya asked, standing guard by the door. "The main frequency is still active," Cassie replied. "If I can amplify the signal and reroute it to the backup channels, we can push the broadcast to a wider range. But it'll take a few minutes." "Just hurry," Skateboard Guy said, peeking out the window. "I don't think we're alone." Cassie's hands trembled as she typed, her focus narrowing to the screen in front of her. The code was familiar, yet complex, each line bringing her closer to their goal. Almost there. Crane arrives. The sound of tires screeching to a halt outside made everyone's head snap up. Maya peered out the window and swore under her breath. "It's him." Cassie's stomach dropped. "Crane?" Maya nodded. "And he brought back up at least 4 guys. We can't fight them all," Pink Hair said, her voice tight. "We don't need to," Cassie said, her fingers still flying over the keyboard. "Just buy me a little more time." Toby stepped forward, his jaw set. "I'll distract them." "No way," Cassie said immediately. "It's too dangerous." "I'm not asking for permission," Toby shot back. "You said it yourself. We're stronger together. Let me do this." Before Cassie could stop him, Toby grabbed the walkie-talkie from Maya's bag and bolted out the door. "Toby!" Cassie called after him, but he was already gone. A desperate standoff. Outside, Crane stood by his SUV, his cold eyes scanning the tower. His men fanned out, their weapons drawn as they approached the building. Toby stepped into the open, holding the walkie-talkie like a lifeline. "Hey," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. Crane's head snapped toward him, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Ah, the little brother," he said, his tone mocking. "Where's your sister?" "Far away from here." Toby lied, his hands trembling. "You're not going to find her." Crane chuckled, gesturing for his men to stop. "Brave, aren't you? But bravery doesn't mean much when you're outnumbered." Toby swallowed hard, his mind racing. He needed to buy Cassie more time. "What's the matter, Crane?" he called, trying to sound confident. "Afraid of what the truth will do to you." Crane's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're talking about, kid." "Don't I?" Toby countered. "The whole city knows now. You can't stop it." Crane took a step forward, his men following. "Maybe, but I can stop you." The signal goes live. Back in the control room, Cassie's fingers flew over the keyboard. Come on," she muttered, her pulse racing. The screen flickered, and then success. The signal was live, amplified, and routed to every backup channel in the network. "We're on," Cassie shouted, her voice trembling with relief. Maya glanced out the window. "Then we need to get out of here. Now." But before they could move, the door burst open, and there stood Crane. To be continued. Crane stood in the doorway, a silhouette of menace against the dim hallway light. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in Cassie at the console, Maya near the window, and Pink Hair gripping a chair leg like a makeshift weapon. Behind him, 2 of his men loomed, their presence suffocating in the small control room. "Well," Crane said, his voice calm but laced with steel, "this is cozy. I was hoping we could have a little chat, Cassie." Cassie's pulse raced as she stood frozen at the control panel. The signal was live, broadcasting to the entire city and beyond. The truth about Crane and the conspiracy was out there now. But with Crane here, she wasn't sure if she'd live to see the fallout. "You're too late," Cassie said, her voice steadier than she expected. "The signal's live. Everyone knows what you've done." Crane's lips curled into a faint smile, but his eyes betrayed no amusement. "Oh, Cassie, you think this is about what people know?" He took a step forward, and Maya moved to block his path, the key card from earlier still clutched in her hand. "Stop right there," Maya said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. Crane tilted his head, as if examining her like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. "You've got guts. I'll give you that." One of Crane's men stepped forward, but Crane held up a hand, stopping him. "No need for violence. Not yet." He turned his gaze back to Cassie. "Do you know what happens to broadcasts, Cassie? People see them, sure, but they're forgotten just as quickly. A fleeting headline, lost in the noise of the world." "Not this one," Cassie shot back. Crane's smile widened, a predator savoring the hunt. "You're betting your life on that." Toby's stand. Outside, Toby was still standing in the open lot, his legs trembling as Crane's remaining men surrounded him. He tried to project confidence, to channel every ounce of bravery he could muster, but their cold stares chipped away at his resolve. "Kid," one of the men growled, "step aside, or you won't like how this ends." Toby gripped the walkie-talkie tighter, his mind racing. He needed to keep their attention on him, away from the tower. "I'm not going anywhere," Toby said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "You think you can scare me into running? Go ahead. Try." The man took a threatening step closer, but before he could do anything, the SUV's headlights blared to life, illuminating the scene. The car door slammed open, and to Toby's surprise, skateboard guy emerged holding a crowbar in one hand. "Back off," skateboard guy said, his voice shaking but resolute. Toby blinked in shock. "What are you doing here? I thought you—" "I'm not leaving you alone," skateboard guy said, his eyes darting between the goons. "You think I'm just going to skate away and let you deal with this by yourself? No way." The men exchanged glances, clearly caught off guard by the sudden reinforcements. Toby nodded at his unlikely ally, a small smile breaking through his fear. "Let's do this." The standoff. Back in the control room, the air was thick with tension. Crane had stepped closer to Cassie, and Maya was still blocking his path, her knuckles white as she gripped the keycard. "Whatever you're planning," Maya said, her voice sharp, "it's over. The truth is out there. You can't stop it now." "Oh, but I can," Crane replied smoothly. "You see, it's not just about stopping the broadcast. It's about silencing the messenger." He turned his gaze back to Cassie, his smile fading. "You've made yourself a target, Cassie. You could have walked away, but you chose to push. Now, I have no choice but to push back." Cassie's chest tightened, but she refused to back down. "You can threaten me all you want, but I'm not afraid of you." Crane chuckled softly. Brave words for someone who doesn't realize how close she is to losing everything. Before anyone could react, Crane snapped his fingers, and his men lunged. Maya swung the chair leg wildly, striking one of the goons across the arm, but he barely flinched. The other man grabbed her, shoving her against the wall as she fought to break free. Pink Hair screamed, throwing a metal canister at the second man, but it only bounced harmlessly off his shoulder. Crane advanced toward Cassie, his expression calm but predatory. "In the broadcast," he said, his voice low and commanding. "No," Cassie said, standing her ground. Crane grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. "I wasn't asking." The turning point. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed through the control room. Everyone turned to see Toby and skateboard guy burst through the door, the crowbar swinging. "Let her go!" Toby shouted, his voice cracking with raw emotion. Crane released Cassie and turned to face the new arrivals, his expression one of mild annoyance. "This is getting tiresome." Toby didn't wait for a response. He charged forward, swinging the crowbar at one of Crane's men. The impact sent the man sprawling, but the other goon lunged at Toby, knocking him to the ground. "Leave him alone!" Cassie shouted, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the corner and slamming it into the back of the man's head. The room descended into chaos. Maya broke free from the man holding her, elbowing him in the ribs and grabbing the keycard he had dropped. Pink Hair joined the fray, swinging a heavy toolbox at the nearest goon. Crane, meanwhile, stood in the center of the chaos, his cold eyes scanning the room. When he saw Cassie running back to the control panel, he moved with frightening speed, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her away. "You're done," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. Cassie struggled against his grip, her heart pounding. "No," she spat, her voice trembling but defiant. You are. Before Crane could respond, the control panel behind him lit up with a flash of red. Maya had used the key card to activate the emergency lockdown sequence, sealing the doors and cutting off Crane's reinforcements. You're trapped, Maya said, panting as she held up the key card. No one's coming to save you. The final broadcast. Cassie broke free from Crane's grip and rushed to the control panel. Her hands flew over the keyboard as she activated the final phase of the broadcast. Everyone needs to see this, she muttered to herself, her fingers trembling with adrenaline. The monitors flickered, and the live feed went active once more. This time, it wasn't just the pre-recorded files. They were broadcasting live from the control room, showing Crane and his men caught in the act. Let them see who you really are, Cassie said, her voice shaking with both fear and determination. Crane turned to the camera, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. You think this will stop me? He snarled. It already has, Cassie replied, her eyes locked on his. Outside the tower, the sounds of approaching sirens filled the air. The arrival of justice. The room fell silent as flashing red and blue lights illuminated the windows. Police officers stormed the tower, breaking through the sealed doors and subduing Crane's men. Crane stood motionless, his icy composure finally giving way to anger as he realized he'd lost. You'll regret this, he said quietly, his words directed at Cassie. No, Cassie replied, her voice steady. I won't. As the officers cuffed Crane and led him away, Cassie sank to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. Toby rushed to her side, wrapping his arms around her. You did it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You really did it. Cassie nodded, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe it was over. The sun rose quietly over the city the next morning, casting soft light across the skyline as if nothing had happened. But Cassie knew better. Everything had changed. She stood on the steps of the broadcasting tower, a blanket draped over her shoulders. The chill of the early morning breeze tickled her skin, but she barely noticed. Around her, the scene was a mix of exhaustion and relief. Police officers milled about, collecting evidence. A few journalists had gathered, their camera crews hurriedly setting up for the breaking news. Maya sat next to Cassie, her face streaked with dirt and exhaustion, but her eyes sparkled with pride. So, we're kind of heroes now, huh? She said, a tired smile tugging at her lips. Cassie laughed softly, shaking her head. Heroes might be pushing it. We just did what we had to do. Maya nudged her shoulder. No, don't downplay it. What you did last night, what we did, that took guts. Real guts. Cassie glanced around, her eyes landing on Toby, who was standing by one of the squad cars, speaking animatedly to an officer. Despite his battered hoodie and scraped knees, there was a confidence in him now, a spark of something she hadn't seen before. He's really grown up, Cassie said softly, watching her younger brother. Maya followed her gaze. Yeah, he's a little badass. I mean, I thought he was crazy going toe-to-toe with Crane's guys, but he held his ground. She paused, then added, Guess bravery runs in the family. Cassie smiled faintly, but the moment was interrupted by a voice calling her name. Cassie! She turned to see an older man in a suit approaching, flanked by a handful of reporters. His face was lined with age, but his sharp eyes carried a mix of respect and urgency. Detective Avery. Cassie greeted him, standing up. Avery nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. You did good, kid. The broadcast, the files, everything. It's all over the news now. People are talking. Crane's operation, it's crumbling as we speak. Cassie exhaled, the weight of his words sinking in. So, it's really over? Not entirely, Avery said, his tone cautious. Crane's behind bars, and his men are being rounded up as we speak. But there's a lot to untangle, money trails, corrupted officials, the whole web of it. It's going to take time. Cassie's stomach twisted. Time? But what if? Avery raised a hand, cutting her off. Listen, you've done your part. You exposed the truth. Now it's on us, the police, the courts, to make sure justice is served. You need to focus on taking care of yourself and your family. Cassie nodded slowly, but the unease in her chest didn't fade. The return home. Later that morning, the siblings returned home, their small apartment feeling both familiar and alien after the events of the past few days. The living room was still cluttered with Toby's schoolwork and empty cereal bowls, and the faint smell of burnt toast lingered from breakfast the day before. Cassie collapsed onto the couch, her body heavy with exhaustion. Toby flopped down beside her, his head resting on her shoulder. "I'm not going to school today," Toby mumbled. Cassie laughed weakly. "Yeah, I think you're in the day off." Maya wandered in from the kitchen, holding 2 mugs of instant coffee. She handed one to Cassie before perching on the armrest of the couch. "So, what's next?" Cassie stared into her coffee, her reflection rippling in the dark liquid. "I don't know. I mean, the broadcast is out there. The world knows the truth. But part of me feels like it's not enough." Maya sipped her coffee, her expression thoughtful. "It's enough for now. You can't change the world overnight, Cass. But you've already done more than most people would even dare to try." Cassie smiled faintly. "Thanks, Maya, for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Maya shrugged, but her grin was playful. "Yeah, well, don't forget that when they're handing out medals, or whatever." Toby snorted. "I want a medal too. Preferably one that says, 'Best little brother ever.'" Cassie rolled her eyes, ruffling his hair. "You're lucky I don't ground you for sneaking out last night." "Hey, I saved your butt," Toby protested. Cassie laughed, the tension in her chest loosening just a bit. The fallout. Over the next few days, the broadcast's ripple effects became impossible to ignore. News channels dissected the footage, and headlines plastered Crane's name and crimes across every major outlet. Protesters gathered outside City Hall, demanding accountability from officials who had been complicit in Crane's schemes. Cassie watched it all unfold from the safety of her apartment, the weight of her actions sinking in more and more with each passing day. One afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Cassie opened it to find an unfamiliar woman standing there, holding a notebook and pen. She was younger than Cassie expected, her round glasses and messy bun giving her a slightly frazzled appearance. "Hi, I'm Emma Walsh," the woman said, holding out her hand. "I'm a journalist with the Sentinel. I was hoping to speak with you about the broadcast." Cassie hesitated, glancing back at Toby and Maya, who were watching curiously from the couch. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," Cassie said cautiously. Emma smiled gently. "I understand, but people deserve to know what you went through to bring the truth to light. Your story could inspire others to stand up, too." Cassie glanced at Maya, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Okay," Cassie said finally, stepping aside to let Emma in. The interview lasted nearly an hour. Cassie recounted everything: the discovery of the files, the chase, the tower, the broadcast. She spoke cautiously at first, but as Emma's questions grew more thoughtful, Cassie found herself opening up. By the time Emma left, Cassie felt lighter, as if sharing her story had lifted some of the weight she'd been carrying. A new path. Weeks passed, and life began to settle into a strange new normal. Crane's trial was scheduled for the following month, and while his lawyers were doing everything they could to discredit the broadcast, the public outcry made it clear that justice was inevitable. Cassie found herself thinking about the future, about what came next. One evening, as she was scrolling through job postings on her laptop, Toby plopped down beside her. "What ya doing?" he asked. "Looking for jobs," Cassie replied. Toby frowned. "Why? You're like a famous whistleblower now. Can't you just, I don't know, write a book or something?" Cassie laughed. "That's not exactly how it works, Tobes." "Well, what do you want to do?" he pressed. Cassie hesitated. She hadn't allowed herself to think about that in a long time. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe something in journalism. Or activism. Something that matters." Toby grinned. "You'd be good at that. You're like really good at standing up to jerks." Cassie smiled, ruffling his hair. "Thanks, kid." The final broadcast. A month later, Cassie found herself back at the broadcasting tower. Not as an intruder this time, but as an invited guest. The station's new director, a fiery woman named Dana, had reached out to Cassie after the broadcast, offering her a chance to share her story on air. As Cassie sat in the studio, the cameras rolling, she felt a mix of nerves and excitement. This time, she wasn't sneaking in. She wasn't running from anyone. She was here to tell the truth. To anyone out there who feels powerless, Cassie said, looking directly into the camera, you're not. It might not feel like it, but your voice matters. The world changes when people are brave enough to speak up, even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous. She paused, her thoughts turning to Toby, Maya, and everyone who had stood by her. You're not alone, she continued. And together, we can make a difference. The light on the camera blinked off, signaling the end of the broadcast. As Cassie stepped out of the studio, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. This was just the beginning. Whatever came next, she was ready.